Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to history class. And today we're gonna start a unit on really what is my favorite period of American history after the Revolutionary War, which is the period of time that we refer to as the Cold War, which really runs arguably from 1945. You might push the start date back a couple years, but from the late 1940s, really heating up in the 1950s, and then continuing in some form or fashion all the way until around 1990 or 91, with it really peaking in the 50s and 60s. And the Cold War is the name that we give to the period of time between World War II and the fall of the Soviet Union, in which basically the United States and the Soviet Union are left as the two superpowers in the world, meaning the two countries that have the most influence, authority, military might, and in general are able to bring the most influence to bear on the direction of other nations. And during this period of time, really America is fighting to preserve the existence of democracy in the world, whereas the Soviet Union is really fighting to spread this ideology of communism, which we've talked about for the wickedness that it is, this idea of eradication, basically, of almost all individualistic value, in this totalitarian view that the only thing that matters is the good of the people, determined in the definition of the people being determined by Marxist philosophy, but ultimately even their class warfare pretensions kind of being subjugated to the success of the communist state. And so you have this period, particularly, the Cold War period is particularly dangerous in the beginning when Joseph Stalin is the leader of the Soviet Union, and he was explicitly expansionistic and imperialistic in his way of looking at things. Some of his successors would be less so, but it's also true that historians overrate the degree to which they were less so. So we'll look at all that. I'm starting to get ahead of myself a little bit. So we need to go back and set the stage a little bit by returning to World War II for just a moment. So in the last couple of videos, we've talked about the defeat of the Japanese and the defeat of Germany. I didn't really, just looking at the lesson plans, I didn't really have time to do like a whole thing in American history on the Holocaust stuff, since more of that happened, over yonder. However, if you're interested, I actually just finished doing a lecture on the Holocaust for the World History class, that you can watch that video on the YouTube channel as well if you're interested. But and then, so that's kind of related to Germany, and then related to Japan. We talked about at length in the last video about the ethics of using the atomic bomb, because we have this kind of unusual reaction to winning the war that's partly jubilation because the war's over after 4 hard years, but also this sense of dread that came from the method of our victory, because we realize that we've been watching humankind progress for a long time, and we've progressed to the point where we've never been more efficient at mass extinction of each other. And it really throws a shock to the system of the world. And even though America is at this point in time, for a brief period of time, the only country with atomic weapons, we're a little scared that we have, opened Pandora's box and there's no way to shut it. And there isn't going to be a way to shut it. And there's now about a dozen countries that have nuclear weapons, and a couple of them are countries you would not want to have them. North Korea, China, Pakistan. So it's the existence of the nuclear bomb is a scary thing. You can do tremendous damage. And so put yourself back in the shoes when we try to look at this late 40s, early 50s. You got to put yourself back in the shoes of people that have just discovered the existence of the nuclear bomb for the first time, and how that would make you feel concerning, mankind's prospects in the future. But we need to go back. There's something we had to kind of skip for time during when we're talking about the war that is vitally important to understanding the setup of the Cold War, and that is something known as the Yalta Conference, which happens just past the midway point of the war, and it is a wartime conference held in Yalta, which was a port city in the Soviet Union, and the Yalta Conference had the leaders of three countries meeting together. They were Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president, Winston Churchill, the British prime minister, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet. I believe their title that he used was premier. Excuse me. Pardon. So anyway, the three of them met to kind of discuss the fate of the post-war world. And we've got this situation where it is at the Yalta Conference where Stalin is trying to push, open up a Western Front, bring a new invasion. And they're planning wartime strategy, but they're also talking about tentative plans for what to do after the war. And Stalin is really trying to arrange the post-war map in such a way to facilitate Soviet and communist domination of the world, or at least large parts of the world, when everything is said and done. Churchill is deeply suspicious of Stalin. Churchill is, he's got a few skeletons in his closet related to his roles in British imperialism. He wasn't a perfect man by any means, but he was a fantastic leader of the British people during World War II. And the same way that Churchill was really able to kind of see through who Hitler was before a lot of British people did, and at a time where his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, thought that he could, make peace with Hitler with the Munich Pact and all this sort of foolishness. Churchill also is he has his eyes wide open about who Joseph Stalin is. He understands that Stalin is a monster, that even though circumstances have forced the Americans and British to fight alongside the Soviet Union to defeat the more urgent threat in Nazi Germany, that Stalin is functionally the same kind of man that Hitler is, capable of the same kind of horrendous deeds. And so he is trying to work against Stalin on a number of different fronts. Roosevelt, therefore, is given the responsibility to sort of be the tiebreaker. Roosevelt has Stalin in his ear on one end, he has Churchill in his ear on the other, and of course Roosevelt is the one whose country has the strongest position of power at the particular moment in time. Now, there's a couple problems with this. First off, Roosevelt was far too trusting, in my opinion, of Stalin. He famously nicknamed Stalin Uncle Joe, which, no, I'm not calling Joseph Stalin Uncle Joe, even if, unless you meant it in a very dark humor sense of the term. I mean, you can't just nonchalant, oh, that's Uncle Joe over there. Stalin's a serious bad guy. Millions of people dead because of this man. And Roosevelt was a little too friendly to him. He really thought that the Russians were going to be helpful. He really thought that Stalin was an ordinary politician, that if I attend to... And Franklin D. Roosevelt was a great politician. He knew how to work congressmen. He knew how to pit one congressman against another to get what he wanted done. And he thought that Stalin was another one of these cats that he could do that with. But Stalin was a different kind of animal. Stalin was was a predator cat. He was a jungle cat. He was a fierce, dictatorial person, and he didn't. He thought this is just another politician. I need to, give him certain things and work on his ego, and we can make a deal. He did not realize the extent to which Stalin was committed to world domination, ultimately, in his and the extent to which he had no regard for human rights or any conception of fairness or morality. Stalin is very much a ruthlessly amoral and evil person. Again, Stalin and Hitler, very, very similar personalities in a lot of ways. So, one, Roosevelt is too trusting. Second, he's getting some bad advice, because his primary advisor at the Yalta Conference, his primary foreign policy guy, his go-to guy, the guy that you see in the movies that like the leader, the president always kind of leans on this guy to give him all of his advice. Like this guy at this conference is a fellow by the name of Alger Hiss. When we get a little bit later into the Cold War, we're going to discover that Alger Hiss was actually a communist sympathizer and believed to be a Soviet spy, and is actually accused publicly of being a Soviet spy in the 1950s by a former Soviet spy named Whittaker Chambers. We're going to talk about all this when we get there. But for years there was this whole thing of, that's a false accusation that right-wing extremists threw at him, and it was kind of a popular cause among, especially more liberal people to say, well, no, Alger Hiss, may have been falsely accused of it. Well, when the Soviet Union fell and they declassified a lot of their information, something called the Venona cables, which were, these documents of the American espionage network that the Soviets had set up, it became proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that yes, Alger Hiss was working for the Soviets while he is Roosevelt's right-hand guy. Meanwhile, on top of that, Roosevelt, if you're going to be doing negotiations with a guy like Stalin, you want to be at the top of your game mentally and physically, and Roosevelt just was not. He was really on the verge of death. He didn't have that much time left. His mental acuity was a little bit less than it had been, it wouldn't be very long after the Yalta Conference that he passed away. So he's not operating at the top of his game. And Stalin is able to really take advantage of him to get a bunch of concessions from Roosevelt and Churchill. So one thing so Roosevelt had this idea. You remember Woodrow Wilson's idea of the League of Nations, and remember how the United States refused to join it after the war because Taft and a lot of the more isolationist Republicans didn't want to go in. So we stayed out of Europe during the 30s. We got involved with the whole Dawes Plan thing. But other than that, we had a more isolationist posture. We tried to leave European affairs over there, hoping we wouldn't get drug into another war. And you can make the case we got drug into another war because we didn't involve ourselves over there. And, there's been, after our kind of misadventure in Iraq, you have started to have a few people kind of go back in time and say maybe we've been too aggressive in getting involved in foreign affairs over the last X amount of decades. But the overwhelming consensus, and the overwhelming bipartisan consensus of most people between 1945 and probably 2005, when the Iraq War started to go sour, with the exception of a few peace activists or whatever, most people kind of agree and kind of said, we probably made a mistake not asserting American influence a little bit more during the critical period where the short-lived German Republic collapsed and Hitler took over, and where Mussolini was able to come to power in Italy, and all this kind of stuff, and we were doing nothing about it. So we kind of started to think that this was a mistake, and we believed that way for decades. The debate's kind of been reopened in recent years, but that was the consensus for decades. And I tend to be a little more internationalist, although I don't think you should overdo it either. I tend to be a moderate on that question. A moderate leaning slightly toward intervention, short of military most of the time. But nonetheless, I mean, it's your opinion, whatever you want to think about that if you study it. But regardless, Roosevelt thought for sure, well, regardless of what you think or I think, Roosevelt said we made a mistake not joining the League of Nations, and we should, the League of Nations fell apart before World War II, but they said we should start a new one like that with a little more teeth that America would be a part of, and so he conceived the idea of the United Nations, or the UN, which we'll talk in a little bit about the UN getting rolling, but Roosevelt is really trying to emphasize this idea, and he's so committed to trying to get Stalin on board with this that he's going to make a few concessions that maybe he shouldn't have. And he turned out to be wrong about the idea that, if we can just get the Russians into the UN, everything's going to be well. We'll be able to talk out of these problems and not have any real conflict. Well, not so much. I suppose, maybe it was helpful in us avoiding a full-on war with the Russians. I suppose, we can't see the counterfactual or the hypothetical world. But it is true that we managed to avoid an open shooting war with the Russians. But, the world peace did not come just because we joined the UN. There's been dozens of wars after. Everyone called World War I the war to end all wars, and then people tried to throw the same label around for World War II. There's been war after war after war across the world. So that was one thing. The other thing that we really wanted, at this point in time, the atomic bomb project is super, super secret, and we're not really sure whether it's going to be ready to roll in time. There's still some questions, and so because of that, Roosevelt really wanted the Russians to go declare war on the Japanese. Stalin did agree. He said as soon as Germany surrenders, we'll declare war on Japan. The Soviets did not want to open a two-front war. They said when the Germans are beaten, we will join you in fighting the Japanese. But there's a catch. We're going to give you a whole bunch of we want a whole bunch of concessions. One of the concessions was they wanted a tremendous amount of the land of Manchuria inside of China, which I remind you that Manchuria is the beginning of World War II in Asia. That the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and trying to take it from China is where the war begins. Further, I want to remind you that Chiang Kai-shek, the head of the Chinese nationalist government, known as the Kuomintang, was who incidentally wanted to attend this meeting and was not invited. That Chiang Kai-shek was fighting with us in the war. And that he was not consulted as we gave away to the Russians the land that the Japanese had originally wanted to take. And of course, obviously, that being put under Soviet occupation is going to make that place a stronghold for the Chinese Communist Party of Mao Zedong when the Chinese Civil War re-erupts at the end of World War II. It's going to play a significant role, in Mao coming to power. And so we kind of... Our mistake there in our rush to get Russia into the Japanese war accidentally kind of set up a communist victory to a certain extent in the Chinese Civil War. Now, I'm not really sure we could have prevented the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War without actually going to a war that would probably have been more than America could, more than could actually be asked of us in terms of troops committed and so on, with a war-weary public. I'm not sure if we could have prevented it, but it certainly didn't help that we were actually kind of doing things that by helping the Soviets kind of helped their allies at the time. Now, the Soviets and the Chinese communists didn't always get along. They had a split, in the 60s, but at this point in time they were allied. Now, the other thing, here's a big whopper. The Soviets also wanted to be able to occupy Poland. Which, if you remember, why did Britain declare war on Germany? The British declared war on Germany to go defend Poland from Nazi conquest. Guess who also invaded Poland, simultaneous to the German attempted conquest of Poland, the Soviet Union. Poland is sitting there. Stalin and Hitler agreed to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Soviet Nazi Pact, where they agreed not to get in each other's way in carving up Poland between the two of them. And now, at the negotiating table of the war that Britain started supposedly to protect the Poles, and the Poles, I want to remind you, are the fourth largest Allied force. So after in the European theater, so after America, Russia, and Britain. Actually, the order was inverted there a little bit. And France, excuse me, not Russia. They were in the Eastern Front. After France, Britain, and America, the fourth largest army was. Oh, knocked my camera out of the way by banging on the wall. I'm getting a little too animated here. It was the Poles after that. The Polish resistance forces completely get sold out. So you have this terrible situation now where we say, yes, Joseph Stalin, who invaded Poland with Hitler at the beginning of the war, you can be the one who occupies Poland when the war is over. Meanwhile, and then they kind of divvy up. They say who's going to occupy Germany when this is over. When Germany is defeated and there's going to be a period of time of martial law until we settle the treaties and all that stuff. Who's going to occupy Germany? And what they do is they basically subdivide Germany in two, and the Russians are going to occupy the eastern half. The western half is going to be divided amongst British, French, and American soldiers. The city of Berlin is going to be located in the eastern half, but because Berlin was the capital and most important city in Germany, they made one exception to the arrangement, which was that the city of Berlin was going to be divided in fourths. A Russian fourth, a French fourth, a British fourth, and an American fourth. And so all four armies are going to occupy the city of Berlin, which is otherwise surrounded by Soviet occupiers, and then the western part is going to be occupied by the other three countries. In all of these countries, similar thing with the idea of Korea. The nation of Korea had been conquered by Japan. The idea was that we were going to liberate them at the end of the war. Who's going to occupy Korea? One of the concessions that is made at Yalta is that the Soviet troops are going to occupy the northern part of the Korean peninsula. The American troops are going to occupy the southern part of the Korean peninsula. Now, if you remember anything from world history last year, or if you remember, some bits and pieces of this, or you just have some knowledge from, from just living in the world, you'll hopefully be noticing that there's a communist North Korea and a communist South Korea. A non-communist South Korea. You may be noticing that for most of from the 50s through the early 90s, that Germany was divided into a West German democracy and an East German communist country. And you may have noticed that the country of Poland became communist. That a lot of the Eastern European lands that Germany had conquered became communist. All of this is set up at the Yalta Conference because at the time, Stalin promises. Now, to be fair, Stalin lied through his teeth. Stalin gave Roosevelt the promise: we're going to have democratic elections, and communist and non-communist forces within each of these regions is going to be able to vote on whether they want to be communist or democracy. Stalin had no intention of following through with this. None. And we'll see that as soon as the war is over and it's time to actually make these promises happen. Roosevelt naively gives him too much trust. Churchill is over there in Roosevelt's ear like, he's lying to you, he's not going to do this, we need to, but, one thing too, Roosevelt was suspicious that Churchill was trying to hold on to the British Empire. And Churchill certainly was an imperialist, so that's not a entirely unreasonable suspicion. But he had real points that Roosevelt is not paying enough attention to. And so the Yalta Conference really, in a dramatic way, sets up the Cold War. Just a few weeks after President Roosevelt wins his unprecedented fourth term. That's literally going to never happen again without another constitutional amendment, because they passed a constitutional amendment such that no one else can do that again. You now can have 2 full terms as president. Some people can have 2.5 terms if they were vice president and the president died or quit, and there's a certain way that you can serve up to 10 years. But for the most part, unless you were VP and something happened, you can only be president for 8 years, 2 4-year terms. But that was after Roosevelt, though. So Roosevelt, he breaks tradition by winning a 3rd term. Then he breaks tradition by running for a 4th term. He wins. Thankfully, he replaces the communist sympathizing vice president that he had, Henry Wallace, with a much more moderate candidate, Harry Truman, who was a senator from Missouri, kind of a what's the best way to say it? He's kind of a crusty old man. He had a prickly personality. Supposedly had one of the foulest mouths of any president we've ever had. Cussed like a sailor. Talked blunt. Didn't like to butter people up. That kind of personality. Truman winds up becoming the vice president for just a few weeks. And it's not long. He serves almost Roosevelt's entire term, just a few weeks after getting sworn in as vice president, and having a decent portfolio of domestic experience, but not foreign policy experience. Truman gets thrust in the position of now being the president of the United States when Roosevelt finally succumbs to his illnesses. And Truman, literally, when he becomes president, does not even know that the atomic bomb exists. And then it's going to be up to him to decide whether to use it or not. Like, he's told about the atomic bomb the day he's sworn in. Like, yes, I solemnly swear, to hold the gun. And then they pull him in the room like, hey, President, something you ought to know about. So, thrust immediately into a difficult situation. We talked about him making the decision to deploy the bomb. But then it's also going to be up to Truman to kind of figure out how to go from here. And it's going to be up to him to kind of figure out what to do in the peace after the war. And on one hand, you can kind of look at it and say maybe having someone who was more of a tough, in-your-face, blunt guy and not a great smooth talker, not a great diplomat, maybe that could have been a problem. But in reality, I think it was a blessing in this case, because I think, honestly, had Roosevelt still been in charge during this time, I think we may have acquiesced to too much Soviet power. That's a little bit of speculation. I could be wrong about that. But I do know that Truman is a guy that's not going to want to just let the Soviets completely dominate everything, although he also is stuck within a certain framework, based on political reality of what did happen at Yalta, and the fact that, the bottom line is there was not a wellspring of support for, starting another war right after World War II to, rescue, the government in China from the communists or anything like that. So based on what he has to really work with, Truman is going to kind of adopt a more adversarial footing with the Soviet Union, and we'll talk about that in the next video here. I guess the one other thing I should add in this little prologue video is that the UN, the United Nations, is established at a conference called the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. It was held in San Francisco. And at Dumbarton Oaks, they drew up a constitution for, well, I don't know if that's the right word to use, but, drew up a charter. That's, I think, the word they used. that called for certain for the UN to promote certain values, predominantly international peace and cooperation. They created kind of a three-tiered structure. So on one hand, there's the United Nations General Assembly that basically every nation in the world has one vote. There's only a handful of countries, like 5 or 6, that aren't a part of the UN. Almost everyone else is. And in the General Assembly level, it's a democratic free-for-all. The United States and Djibouti, which is a real country, have the same vote in the General Assembly. And then you have what they call the United Nations Security Council. And the United Nations Security Council was kind of created for the purpose of trying to prevent, a World War III situation. But they're also empowered if one country is going rogue. The United Nations Security Council is empowered to call for an international UN army to get, armies of the world to unite against said country. And that's been done a few times, which we'll talk about them over the course of these last few weeks here. And the Security Council is a little less democratic. There's 5 permanent members: Britain, Russia, America, France, and China, if I'm not mistaken. And then they alternate some other members. But any of they'll have 3 at a time and vote on them for different terms. But the 5 core members of the Security Council, any one of them can veto an action of the UN Security Council. Those 5 countries have to be unanimous to get the Security Council to do anything. One no vote shuts down an operation. So, is the UN a good thing or a bad thing? There's some dangers that have come along with the UN. I'll do the good things first. The good thing about the UN is it is like a place that people can go to hash stuff out, that, people are always there in the room, right? And so the conversations are at times easy to have. So it's probably facilitated, some diplomacy, especially in the time when maybe it was a little harder to do all of this kind of stuff over the telephone and stuff than it might be now. And the UN, by virtue of having the consent of almost every country in the world, when the UN does condemn a particular practice, like genocide in a region or something like that, there's usually a certain there's a different level of international cooperation that comes along with something having been condemned by the UN. So those are some of the good, and the UN has does have this Atomic Energy Commission that tries to work against nuclear proliferation and stuff like that. So there are some good things, some bad things about the UN. First off, there's the ever-present danger of it becoming more and more governmental and taking away national sovereignty, right? There's always certain elements that are, that wouldn't mind it moving into a closer connection, right? So that's one thing. More directly, because I don't see the nations of the world forming a UN super parliament tomorrow, but the more real danger is the fact that democracies and non-democracies have the same say in the General Assembly. And what often happens is dictators look out for each other. And so there's certain voting blocks within the UN that you just know, it's almost like going to Congress, Republicans and Democrats are going to vote one way or the other. It's almost like dictators and non-dictators are going to vote one way or the other. And so the dictators kind of vote as a block and prevent the UN from doing a lot of what it was there to do. The UN has also been very unfair in certain policies, particularly as it relates to the nation of Israel, that they have condemned the nation of Israel more than all the other countries of the world combined. Now, is Israel the worst country in the world? I'm afraid not. I'm not saying that the Israeli government has never crossed a line dealing with the Palestinians in a situation. I'm sure they have. In fact, I know they have at times. But you cannot act like the nation of Israel is significantly worse than Idi Amin's Uganda, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Ceausescu's Romania, Stalin's Russia, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Khomeini's Iran, put together. And they have literally condemned Israel more than all the other nations of the world put together. So they've given voice to a lot of anti-Semitism. They've given voice. There's a very socialistic bent in terms of a lot of the thinking of the United Nations as an organization, and tends to promote socialism. Has used some of its funding, much of which comes from various governments of the world, but a lot of it coming from the United States, has used its funding to promote, ungodly things like abortion and things like that. So there's an awful lot to criticize about the United Nations. And then if you come back and say, well, fundamentally, has it kept world peace? Well, it may or may not have contributed, and a lot of foreign policy experts would say that it did, contribute to avoiding an American-Russian war, which is a major, major thing, because if the U.S. and the Soviet Union had ever gone into a for-real shooting war, it's very likely that you and I would both have never been born because our parents would have died. Because it just would have been, millions of people would have died. So if that's all it ever did, that was a good thing. On the other hand, it did not stop war across the world, right? America's been in several of them since the UN started. But also, there's no telling how many wars have been in places like the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, all across the world. So, it did not cause world peace just because you could throw a bunch of diplomats in a room and make speeches. So some of the optimism about what the UN is going to accomplish is similar to, the kind of laughable, if you remember the Kellogg-Briand Pact after World War I, they basically all signed this treaty like, oh, we're outlawing war, and war is never going to exist again. And I'm like, well, yeah, probably not. Yeah, so anyway, so this prologue took a lot longer than I expected, so I guess it's going to become its own video, but that kind of is starting to set the stage for the Cold War and the situation that Harry Truman finds himself in, and to that we will turn our attention now.